Okay, so on the previous video we learned how to just graph y equals the sine of x and y equals the cosine of x. And those are going to be our parent functions. So I use that term because that's something you probably used in Algebra 2. For example, when you learn to graph different versions of quadratics or parabolas, you learned how to graph f of x equals x squared, and then learned about transformations. And this g of x would be shifted to the right 3 up 1 and then vertically stretched by a factor of 2. Alright, so you start off with the idea of a parabola and then transform it. Alright, the same thing with graphing sine and cosine. We start off with the pictures that we just graphed in the previous video, y equals the sine of x, y equals the cosine of x, and then we transform it from there. So I'm going to be using these letters, A, B, C, and D, to refer to the different numbers in the sine or cosine equation. So A is the number that's getting multiplied by sine or cosine. B is the number in front of x. C is what's being subtracted from bx in the parentheses. And D is what you add or subtract, D could be negative, to the entire function. Alright, so let's start off with D. That's kind of like the easiest place to start. That's going to shift our graph up or down. Alright, so y equals D we're going to call the sinusoidal axis, or I've also heard it being called the midline. And the first thing I do when graphing any trig function is set up my axes. And then once I set up the axes, then I could plot my points from there. Okay, so our y-axis is, we're going to plot a point right here at -2. That's going to be the middle of our graph, because normally it's on the x-axis, but this -2 is going to shift all our points down 2 units. So normally our max is at 1 and -1, or our min is at -1, max is at 1. So our maximum is now going to be at -1, 1 unit above that axis, and our min is going to be at -3, 1 unit below that axis. Now the max and the min is not always 1 unit above or below the midline or the sinusoidal axis. We'll learn about how that changes later on. So our y-axis set up, and sometimes I even like to put a little dotted line here to show like that's the sinusoidal axis, so that's like where the graph hangs. And then our x-axis is not going to be affected. We will see how that changes later on, but for now it's going to be the same 4 points that we're going to graph, or I guess 5 points. Alright, so since it's sine, we start right on the midline, and then it's not reflected, so it's going to go up to the max, back down to the middle, down to the minimum, and then back to where we started. And that would be 1 period of y equals the sine of x minus 2. Alright, now let's try f of x equals the cosine of x plus 1. Okay, so I got my x-axis and my y-axis. Alright, and now this graph is going to be shifted up 1. So I'm going to plot my midline right here at y equals 1. Okay. And then on my axis, I'm also going to plot my max and my min. So 2 there, and then we also have the origin, which represents the minimum of our graph here. Alright, our x-axis is going to be set up the same way, because we haven't changed the period yet, but that will be changed later on. Alright, and now we plot our points. Now since it's cosine is going to start at the max, because the cosine of 0 is 1, and then 1 plus 1 is 2. Alright, if there was a negative, if it was like y equals negative cosine of x plus 1, then in that case we would start at 0, because then it would be -1 plus 1. Alright, and the negative would reflect the graph over the x-axis. Okay, now we start at the max, so we go 1 interval over, and we're at the middle, and then down to the minimum, halfway through a period. 3/4 of the way through our period at 3 pi over 2, we are back to the midline, and then as we complete 1 full period, we're right back to where we started, at the maximum, at the point 2 pi, comma 2. Alright, and that's what the graph of f of x equals the cosine of x plus 1 would look like. Alright, in the next video, we will look at changing the other variables, but that's pretty much all you need to know for D. It's going to shift the graph up or down.